Ladies and gentlemen, pause for a moment and notice this simple fact. Your mind is always speaking, even when you are silent. Thoughts rise, fall, repeat themselves, argue with one another, and often command your actions without ever asking for your permission. Most of us live as if this inner voice is who we are, as if every fear, doubt, and restless desire deserves obedience. Yet the greatest tragedy is not that the mind wanders, but that we rarely question who is listening. From the moment you wake up, the mind rushes ahead, replaying yesterday's mistakes or rehearsing tomorrow's worries. It convinces you that peace exists somewhere in the future, that joy must be earned, and that you are incomplete as you are. Slowly, almost invisibly, this constant noise shapes your choices, your relationships, and even your faith. If left unchecked, it builds prisons out of habits, labels, and beliefs, and then persuades you that those walls are permanent. But there is good news, and it is deeply hopeful. You are not created to be ruled by confusion, fear, or compulsive thought. There is within you a deeper awareness, a quiet center where clarity lives, and where faith is not an idea but an experience. When you learn to observe the mind rather than be dragged by it, something remarkable happens. The grip of anxiety loosens. Old patterns begin to lose their authority. You discover that you are not your thoughts, you are the one who witnesses them. This realization is not about escaping the world or silencing the mind forever. It is about reclaiming responsibility for the direction of your life before unconscious habits decide it for you. Faith, in its truest sense, becomes trust in that inner stillness where wisdom speaks without shouting. In that space you find strength to act, courage to change, and peace that does not depend on circumstances. What we explore today is not merely self-control, but self-awareness, and through it, the freedom to live with intention, purpose, and grace before time slips quietly through our fingers. The mind speaks constantly, shaping life without our awareness. From the moment consciousness stirs in the morning until the body finally rests at night, there is a continuous stream of inner dialogue unfolding within us. Thoughts comment on everything we see, judge every experience, predict outcomes, recall memories, and create stories about who we are and what the world means. This mental activity feels so familiar, so intimate, that we rarely stop to notice it as something separate from ourselves. Instead, we assume it is us, and in doing so we surrender immense power without ever realizing it. Most people believe they are making choices freely, yet those choices are often reactions to thoughts that appeared automatically. A thought says, "This is dangerous," and the body tenses. A thought says, "You are not enough," and confidence fades. A thought says, "You must hurry or you will fail," and anxiety takes control. These thoughts arrive uninvited, but they are obeyed as if they carry unquestionable authority. Over time, this silent obedience becomes a way of life, and the mind, unchecked, becomes the hidden architect of behavior, relationships, and destiny. What makes this process so powerful is its invisibility. Just as a fish is unaware of the water it swims in, most people are unaware of the mental atmosphere surrounding them. The mind narrates life so convincingly that it feels like reality itself. Past regrets are relived as if they are happening now. Future fears are experienced in advance, draining peace from the present moment. Slowly, life is no longer lived directly but filtered through thought, and awareness becomes trapped in interpretation rather than experience. This constant mental commentary also shapes identity. Repeated thoughts harden into beliefs, and beliefs form the image we carry of ourselves. I am weak, I am unlucky, I am not spiritual enough, I am always late. These statements may have begun as passing thoughts, but repetition turns them into self-definitions. Once accepted, they guide decisions automatically, limiting potential and reinforcing the very patterns they describe. The mind then points to the results and says, "See, I was right," completing the cycle. Yet the most subtle danger lies not in negative thoughts alone, but in unconsciousness itself. Even pleasant thoughts, ambitions, and ideals can dominate when they are not seen clearly. The mind can turn success into obsession, faith into fear of failure, and discipline into rigidity. When awareness is absent, even good intentions become another form of bondage. Life begins to feel rushed, heavy, and disconnected, not because of circumstances, but because the mind is constantly pulling attention away from what is real and immediate. Faith traditions across time have pointed to this same truth in different language. Transformation does not begin by fighting the mind, but by waking up to it. Awareness is the light that reveals the machinery behind the scenes. When you notice that the mind is speaking, something shifts instantly. The thought continues, but it no longer owns you in the same way. A small space opens between the observer and the voice, and in that space lies choice, clarity, and responsibility. This awakening is not dramatic or mystical. It is simple, yet profoundly life-altering. It begins the moment you recognize that thoughts are events happening within consciousness, not commands carved in stone. As this recognition deepens, the mind loses its unconscious grip, and life starts to be lived with intention rather than impulse, with trust rather than fear, with presence rather than endless mental noise. Unquestioned thoughts quietly become beliefs and habits, shaping the direction of a life without ever announcing their influence. A single thought, when observed, has very little power. It appears, lingers briefly, and fades away. But when that same thought goes unnoticed and unexamined, it sinks deeper into the mind, repeating itself until it feels familiar, and familiarity is often mistaken for truth. Over time, what began as a momentary idea settles into belief, and belief slowly transforms into behavior that feels automatic and unavoidable. The mind learns through repetition. Each time a thought is accepted without awareness, it leaves an impression, like a footprint pressed into soft ground. At first, the mark is faint, almost invisible, but with enough repetition a clear path forms, and the mind begins to follow it without effort. This is how habits are born. A habitual reaction is nothing more than a thought pattern that has been rehearsed so often it now operates on its own. Anger, self-doubt, procrastination, fear, even overthinking itself are not permanent traits, but learned mental movements that were never questioned at their beginning. Beliefs feel solid because they are reinforced by memory. The mind searches the past to justify what it already assumes to be true. If the belief is "I always fail," the mind will highlight every failure and ignore every success. If the belief is "people cannot be trusted," every disappointment becomes evidence, while moments of loyalty fade into the background. In this way, the mind builds a closed system, constantly proving itself right, not because it is accurate, but because it is selective. Awareness is absent, and so the belief continues to strengthen without challenge. These unconscious beliefs do not remain confined to the mind. They shape posture, tone of voice, decision-making, and even the way faith is practiced. A person who believes they are unworthy may pray with fear rather than trust. A person who believes the world is hostile may approach life with defensiveness instead of openness. Over time, the outer life begins to reflect the inner assumptions, and the mind points to these results as confirmation that its beliefs were correct all along, deepening the illusion. Habits formed from unquestioned thoughts eventually feel like entity. The phrase, "this is just how I am," is often the final stage of unconscious belief. Once a habit is labeled as identity, change feels threatening, even impossible. The mind resists awareness because awareness would expose the fact that what seemed fixed is actually flexible. Yet beneath every habit lies a moment that was never examined, a thought that was never brought into the light of consciousness. The quiet tragedy is that most people try to change habits without ever addressing the beliefs that created them. They fight behavior with willpower while leaving the underlying thought patterns untouched. This creates frustration and exhaustion, because effort alone cannot dissolve what is unconscious. Real change begins not with force, but with attention. When a thought is seen clearly, without judgment or resistance, its grip begins to loosen naturally. Faith, in its deepest form, supports this awakening. It invites trust beyond mental stories and opens the heart to a greater intelligence than habitual thought. When awareness is present, beliefs are no longer prisons but passing ideas. Habits lose their inevitability, and the mind becomes a tool rather than a master. Life begins to respond not to old patterns, but to conscious presence. where choice is possible and transformation becomes a living experience rather than a distant hope. Most suffering begins with identification with the inner voice, the constant stream of commentary that claims to be me and speaks as if it knows the truth about everything. This voice narrates experience, labels emotions, judges actions, and interprets events, and because it sounds so familiar, it is rarely questioned. When a thought says, "I am anxious," or "I am angry," or "I am afraid," the mind does something subtle yet powerful. It turns a passing mental event into an identity, and in that moment, suffering is born. The pain itself may arise from a real situation, loss, uncertainty, failure, or change, but suffering deepens when the mind wraps a story around that pain. The inner voice replays what happened, imagines what could have been different, predicts what might go wrong next, and then attaches all of it to the sense of self. Instead of feeling sadness, one becomes a sad person. Instead of experiencing fear, one becomes someone who is fearful. This identification locks awareness into the narrative, and the mind begins to feed on its own conclusions. Once identification takes place, the body responds as if the story were absolute reality. Muscles tense, breathing shortens, and the nervous system enters a state of constant alert. The mind then points to these physical sensations as proof that the story is true. Anxiety confirms anxious thoughts. Tension confirms fearful predictions. The loop closes and the person feels trapped inside an experience they believe they are. At this point, even moments of peace can feel uncomfortable, because the mind has grown accustomed to noise and struggle. This inner voice also thrives on comparison. It measures the self against others, against ideals, against imagined expectations. It says, "You should be further along, you are falling behind, others are better, stronger, more faithful." Each comparison reinforces the sense of a separate self that is lacking and incomplete. Suffering increases not because of what is happening, but because of what the mind says it means. Life becomes a courtroom where the inner voice is both prosecutor and judge, rarely allowing rest. In matters of faith and purpose, identification with the inner voice can be especially heavy. Doubt is interpreted as failure. Questions are seen as weakness. The mind insists that certainty must be achieved before peace is allowed. Instead of faith being a living trust, it becomes a mental struggle to believe the right thoughts and silence the wrong ones. The inner voice turns spirituality into another arena for self-judgment, increasing suffering in the very place where relief is sought. Yet the inner voice is not the enemy. It is a function of the mind, designed to interpret and organize experience. Suffering arises not from its presence, but from mistaking it for the totality of who we are. The moment this is seen, even briefly, a shift occurs. The voice continues, but it is heard rather than obeyed. Awareness steps back, and the sense of self loosens from the narrative. In that space of witnessing, emotions are allowed to move without being possessed. Sadness flows without becoming identity. Fear arises without defining the future. Anger appears without hardening into resentment. There is room for compassion, both for oneself and for others, because the struggle is no longer personal in the same way. Faith begins to feel less like a mental achievement and more like a quiet confidence in something deeper than thought, a still presence that remains untouched by the noise of the inner voice and offers peace not by changing the story, but by revealing that the story was never the whole truth. Awareness creates distance between the observer and the thought, and this distance is the beginning of inner freedom. A thought arises suddenly, often without warning, and the usual habit is to follow it immediately, to believe it, analyze it, or resist it. In that instant, awareness collapses into thinking, and the thought takes center stage. But when awareness remains present and notices the thought instead of becoming it, a subtle separation appears. The thought is still there, but it is no longer fused with the sense of self. This distance is not created by effort or force. It happens naturally the moment attention shifts from the content of the thought to the fact that a thought is occurring. The difference is profound. Instead of asking whether the thought is right or wrong, awareness simply observes it as an event passing through the mind. In this observation, the thought loses its urgency. It no longer demands immediate reaction. Like a sound heard in the distance, it is recognized without being chased. Many people fear this distance, believing it will make them detached, indifferent, or passive. In truth, the opposite is experienced. When thoughts are seen clearly, action becomes more precise, not less. Reactions driven by fear, habit, or impulse give way to responses guided by clarity. Awareness does not remove emotion. It allows emotion to move without distortion. Anger can be felt without becoming violence. Sadness can be experienced without turning into despair. Joy can be enjoyed without clinging or fear of loss. This space between observer and thought also reveals how temporary mental patterns truly are. Thoughts that once felt overwhelming are seen to rise and fall on their own when they are not fed by identification. Worry, when observed, often dissolves into silence. Self-criticism loses its sharpness when it is heard rather than believed. Even deeply rooted thoughts begin to loosen as awareness shines on them consistently, not with the intention to change them, but with the willingness to see them. In daily life, this awareness transforms ordinary moments. A triggering situation arises, and instead of reacting automatically, there is a pause. In that pause, choice appears. The mind may suggest old responses, but awareness recognizes them as suggestions, not commands. Over time, this pause grows longer and more stable, allowing behavior to align with values rather than impulses. Life begins to feel less like a series of reactions and more like a conscious participation. Faith deepens. Naturally, in this space, when the mind quiets, even briefly, a sense of trust emerges that is not dependent on answers or explanations. Awareness reveals a stillness beneath thought that feels steady and reliable. This stillness does not argue or persuade, it simply is. From it arises patience, humility, and a gentle confidence that life can be met as it unfolds. Doubt loses its power because faith is no longer an idea to defend, but an experience to rest in. The observer itself becomes clearer with practice. One begins to recognize that awareness is always present, even when thoughts are chaotic. It was there before the thought appeared and remains after it fades. This recognition brings a profound shift in identity. Instead of defining oneself by mental activity, one identifies with the presence that notices it. The mind becomes a tool, useful and creative, but no longer dominant. As awareness continues to create space between the observer and the thought, inner life becomes more spacious and less tense. Silence is no longer empty or frightening, it is nourishing. The constant need to control outcomes softens, replaced by attentiveness to the present moment. From this attentiveness, wise action emerges naturally, rooted not in fear or compulsion, but in clarity and trust, allowing life to be lived with greater ease, depth, and authenticity. Control begins with observation, not force or suppression, because the mind does not respond to domination the way the body might. When people attempt to control their thoughts through willpower, they often discover that the mind reacts by becoming louder, more restless, and more resistant. A thought that is pushed away tends to return with greater intensity, demanding attention and creating inner conflict. This struggle drains energy and reinforces the illusion that the mind is something to be battled rather than understood. Observation works differently. It does not argue with the thought or try to replace it with a better one. It simply watches. In this watching, the thought is allowed to exist without being fed. It is neither approved nor condemned. This neutral attention removes the fuel that keeps the thought alive. Without resistance and without identification, the thought begins to lose its momentum naturally, much like a fire dies down when no more fuel is added. Many people misunderstand observation, believing it to be passive or weak. In reality, it requires great honesty and courage. To observe a thought means to face it directly, without escape and without distraction. It means seeing fear without turning away, noticing anger without acting it out, and acknowledging desire without immediately pursuing it. This kind of attention brings clarity, and clarity is a far more powerful form of control than suppression ever could be. The habit of force is deeply rooted in conditioning. From an early age, people are taught to control themselves by discipline, punishment, or reward. While this may shape external behavior, it rarely brings inner freedom. Suppressed thoughts remain active beneath the surface, influencing mood and action in subtle ways. What is not allowed into awareness does not disappear. It operates in the shadows. Observation brings these hidden patterns into the light, where they can be seen clearly and lose their unconscious power. As observation deepens, patterns begin to reveal themselves. The same worries appear at the same times. The same reactions arise in similar situations. The mind starts to look less mysterious and more mechanical. This recognition is liberating. When you see that a reaction is simply a repeated pattern, it no longer feels personal. You stop blaming yourself, and self-compassion replaces self-judgment. This compassionate clarity creates conditions for real change. In moments of strong emotion, observation acts as an anchor. Instead of being swept away by anger or fear, awareness stays present with the sensation itself. The tightness in the chest, the heat in the face, the quickening of the breath are noticed without interpretation. By staying with the raw experience, rather than the story about it, the emotion is allowed to move and release. Control emerges not because the emotion was defeated, but because it was understood. Faith supports this process by encouraging trust in awareness rather than in force. There is a quiet confidence that comes from knowing you do not have to fix every thought or feeling. Life is allowed to unfold while you remain attentive and present. This trust softens the need to dominate the inner world and replaces it with respect for its natural rhythms. Over time, the mind becomes calmer, not because it is controlled, but because it is no longer constantly resisted. Through observation, action becomes more aligned. Decisions are made from clarity instead of compulsion. Speech becomes more measured, guided by understanding rather than reaction. Even silence becomes meaningful, a space where insight arises on its own. Control in this sense is not about tightening the grip, but about loosening it enough for awareness to guide the way, allowing the mind to serve life rather than rule it. Faith grows when inner noise gives way to stillness, because faith is not born from constant mental activity, but from a quiet trust that exists beneath it. The mind is skilled at questioning, doubting, analyzing, and seeking certainty, yet it is never fully satisfied. Every answer produces another question, and every conclusion opens the door to new uncertainty. When faith is pursued only through thought, it becomes fragile, dependent on ideas that must be defended and beliefs that must be constantly reinforced. Inner noise keeps faith restless, always searching, rarely resting. Stillness is not the absence of thought, but the absence of struggle with thought. It appears when awareness stops chasing mental commentary and allows the present moment to be as it is. In this quiet space, something deeper than reasoning begins to speak. It is not a voice that argues or persuades, but a sense of knowing that does not require explanation. Faith arises here naturally, not as a concept to believe in, but as an experience to be felt. Many people fear stillness because it removes familiar mental distractions. The mind often uses noise to avoid discomfort, uncertainty, or unresolved emotion. Silence can feel like emptiness at first, and the ego resists it by creating more thought. But when stillness is allowed to deepen, it reveals itself as fullness rather than lack. There is a sense of being supported by something greater than personal effort, a quiet assurance that life is not as chaotic as the mind suggests. In this stillness, prayer changes its nature. Instead of being a list of requests or a mental dialogue, it becomes a state of listening. Words fall away and attention rests in presence. This form of prayer does not seek to control outcomes, but to align the heart with trust. Faith is strengthened, not by asking for certainty, but by releasing the need for it. The inner noise that once demanded answers begins to soften, replaced by patience and acceptance. Stillness also reshapes how challenges are faced. When the mind is loud, difficulties are interpreted as threats, and fear dominates perception. In stillness, the same challenges are met with steadiness. There is space to respond rather than react, to act with wisdom rather than panic. Faith becomes a source of resilience, not because it promises comfort, but because it provides grounding. One feels root, even when circumstances are unstable. As inner noise fades, the sense of separation diminishes. The constant mental emphasis on me and my problems loosens, allowing a broader perspective to emerge. Compassion grows naturally, both for oneself and for others. Judgments soften, and understanding deepens. Faith expresses itself not only in belief, but in action, through kindness, patience, and humility that arise without effort. Stillness cannot be forced, and this is its paradox. The more one tries to become still, the more the mind resists. Stillness arrives when effort relaxes and awareness remains open. It is discovered rather than achieved. In this discovery, faith feels less like something you hold on to, and more like something that holds you. The inner world becomes quieter, not empty, but alive with a subtle presence that does not need to announce itself. Over time, this presence becomes familiar. Even in the midst of activity and thought, there is an underlying calm that remains untouched. Faith no longer depends on circumstances, moods, or mental clarity. It flows from an inner connection that persists through uncertainty and change. Inner noise may return, but it no longer dominates. Stillness remains accessible, reminding you that beneath every thought and emotion, there is a depth where trust lives naturally and steadily. Freedom appears when thoughts lose their authority, not because thoughts disappear, but because their role is finally understood. The mind was never meant to be a ruler issuing commands. It was meant to be a servant offering suggestions. Yet for most people, this relationship has been reversed. Thoughts are treated as absolute truths, and life is shaped around their demands. When a thought says you cannot, action stops. When a thought says you must, tension arises. Authority is granted automatically, and freedom quietly fades into the background. This authority is maintained through belief. A thought gains power only when it is believed. Without belief, it is just a sound in the mind, a fleeting movement of energy. The moment belief is withdrawn, a thought loses its grip. It may still appear, but it no longer dictates behavior or emotion. This shift does not require replacing negative thoughts with positive ones. It requires seeing that all thoughts, regardless of their content, are provisional and temporary. As thoughts lose authority, fear begins to dissolve. Fear thrives on imagined futures and remembered pasts, both of which exist only as thought. When these mental images are seen as constructions, rather than predictions or facts, their emotional charge weakens. The body relaxes, breathing deepens, and the nervous system settles. Freedom is felt not as excitement, but as relief. The relief of no longer being driven by scenarios that exist only in the mind. This freedom also changes the way choices are made. Decisions are no longer reactions to mental pressure, but responses to present clarity. Instead of asking, "What does my fear say?" or "What will people think?" there is a deeper listening to what feels true and aligned. Thoughts may still offer opinions, but they are consulted rather than obeyed. Life becomes more fluid, less constrained by rigid mental rules and expectations. In relationships, the loss of thought authority brings honesty and openness. Old stories about being rejected, misunderstood, or unappreciated no longer dominate interaction. Listening becomes deeper because attention is not consumed by internal commentary. Words are chosen with care, not to protect an image, but to express truth. Freedom here is not about detachment, but about presence, the ability to meet another person without the filter of past assumptions. Faith deepens in this state of freedom. Hen thoughts no longer dominate. Trust arises naturally. The need to control outcomes through constant planning and worrying diminishes. There is a sense that life can be met as it unfolds, moment by moment. Faith becomes less about believing the right ideas and more about surrendering to the intelligence of the present. This surrender is not passive, it is attentive and responsive, rooted in awareness rather than anxiety. The loss of thought authority does not make life predictable or easy, but it makes it honest. Pain is felt without resistance, joy is experienced without clinging, and uncertainty is faced without panic. The inner landscape becomes spacious, allowing experience to come and go without being labeled as success or failure. Freedom is found not in controlling life, but in meeting it without the constant interference of mental judgment. As this freedom stabilizes, a quiet confidence emerges. It is not based on self-image or achievement, but on the knowledge that no thought has the power to define or limit you. Even challenging thoughts are welcomed as passing visitors, not as rulers. The mind continues to function, to plan and imagine, but its voice is no longer mistaken for truth. In this clarity, life feels lighter, more immediate and more real, guided not by fear or compulsion, but by an inner openness that allows each moment to unfold on its own terms. Conscious living must begin before patterns become destiny, because what is repeated without awareness slowly hardens into a life path that feels inevitable. Every day, small choices are made almost automatically, shaped by habits of thought, emotion and reaction that were formed long ago. These choices seem insignificant in isolation, yet together they create momentum. When awareness is absent, momentum takes over, and life begins to feel as though it is happening to you rather than being lived by. Patterns are created quietly. A certain way of responding to stress becomes familiar. A certain way of avoiding discomfort becomes routine. A certain story about who you are and what you can expect from life is rehearsed again and again. Over time, these patterns interlock, forming a structure that guides behavior without conscious decision. The mind then calls this structure reality, when in truth it is simply habit reinforced by time. Destiny, as it is commonly understood, is often nothing more than unconscious repetition. The same fears produce the same decisions. The same beliefs attract the same situations. The same reactions create the same outcomes. Without awareness, the future is built from the past, replayed in different forms. This is not fate imposed from outside, but momentum generated from within. Conscious living interrupts this process by bringing light to what was previously automatic. The moment awareness enters, patterns begin to loosen. A reaction is noticed before it fully takes over. A habitual thought is seen as it arises. A familiar emotion is felt without being acted upon immediately. These moments of noticing may seem small, but they are powerful. Each one creates a break in the chain of repetition. In that break, choice becomes possible. Life begins to open in new directions, not through dramatic change, but through subtle shifts in attention. Conscious living does not require withdrawing from the world or abandoning responsibility. It means meeting life as it unfolds, with presence rather than autopilot. Work is done with attention instead of haste. Relationships are approached with listening instead of assumption. Even challenges are faced with curiosity rather than resistance. This presence transforms experience, not by changing circumstances, but by changing the way they are inhabited. Faith plays a vital role in conscious living, because awareness requires trust. It requires the willingness to step out of familiar mental routines and face the uncertainty of the present moment. The mind prefers the known, even when the known is painful. Faith provides the courage to remain present without clinging to old patterns for security. It invites surrender, not to passivity, but to a deeper intelligence that operates beyond habitual thought. When conscious living is delayed, patterns gain strength. Years pass and habits become identities. The phrase "it's too late" begins to appear, not because change is impossible, but because awareness has been postponed for so long that momentum feels overwhelming. Yet the truth remains that awareness is always available now. It does not depend on age, circumstance, or past mistakes. It begins the instant attention returns to the present. As conscious living deepens, life feels less mechanical and more alive. Moments are no longer rushed through in pursuit of some future fulfillment. Meaning is found in presence rather than projection. Even ordinary experiences carry depth because they are fully met. Destiny, once thought to be fixed, reveals itself as flexible, shaped not by unconscious repetition, but by awareness guiding action in real time. The greatest opportunity lies not in predicting or controlling the future, but in becoming conscious before habits decide it for you. Each moment of awareness is a quiet act of freedom, a refusal to let the past dictate the present. In this way, conscious living is not a philosophy, but a practice lived now where patterns dissolve, direction clarifies, and life unfolds with intention rather than inevitability.